Today we're going to talk about naturalizing the city and also urbanizing environmentalism. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at some attempts to green the city, to bring the life world of nature into the city as a design practice, as a therapeutic practice, as an ethical practice. We're also going to look at some changes in environmentalism, especially I think in the United States, where environmentalists have become more focused on urban issues and more sensitive to urban environments as landscapes and as places of moral concern. And so what I've done is I've identified a few key themes that I want you to be thinking about as you read the material for this topic. And one of the themes I think is quite interesting, which is the idea that American environmentalism has typically been anti-urban, and by that I mean there's been kind of a bias in American environmentalism against urban landscapes as places worthy of concern, and a preference in many cases for the wilderness, for the untouched, for the pristine. And we're going to talk about that and the legacy of that way of thinking about landscapes and value for cities and for discussions around urban sustainability. We're also going to look very quickly at some historical efforts to green the city or to naturalize the city, to bring nature in a more explicit way into the daily lives of urban dwellers. We'll, at the same time, consider contemporary attempts to really rethink what it means to be green. The traditional understanding has been, what it means to be green is to care about endangered species and to live in a kind of pastoral setting, a green landscape, a rural setting perhaps. There are some very important efforts going on today and some somewhat controversial arguments being made that dense urban environments, including places as built up and as artificial as New York City, as Manhattan, are in fact the greenest spots on the landscape, or certainly could be the greenest spots on the landscape. And finally, we'll talk about this trend to urbanize environmental activism and environmental practice. We'll talk about the environmental justice movement very briefly and the rise of attempts to create what's often called a civic ecology, or a very community-oriented approach to environmental protection and concern. So the background for talking about this anti-urban bias, as I've suggested, that exists in American environmentalism in particular, can be set up by looking at some of the works of the American naturalists. And probably the best one to use in this case is John Muir, the great wilderness advocate and nature writer, very active in the late 19th and early 20th century in the U.S., associated with the protection of Yosemite National Park in California, for example. Muir wrote about his trip to New York City in his book, A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, and he talked about how he saw the name Central Park on some of the streetcars and maybe would want to go there, but he was worried he couldn't find his way back, and he dared not make the adventure, in his words. He felt completely lost in the vast throngs of people, the noise of the streets, and the immense size of the buildings. He said, often I thought I would like to explore the city if, like a lot of wild hills and valleys, no one was there. So that, I think, is fairly typical of the tradition, where you see this antipathy toward the urban environment, because it's crowded, because it's overpopulated, because it's not natural. Muir, before him Henry Thoreau, and I think even well through the 20th century, you see this tradition of this kind of hostility toward the city as a place that's not desirable. The anti-urbanism of American environmentalism, and I don't think this is just an American story. I mean, I think we can see this in perhaps some parts of Europe, but we certainly see it in Australia and in other places as well, idealizes the notion of the wilderness. And this is probably quintessentially American. This was kind of the iconic environment of the settlement of the United States, wrapped up in national identity. What the U.S. had was not the crown jewels of Europe. It had the crown jewels of the national parks, and they were associated with ideas of pristine or wild nature. So wilderness emerged as an ideal, as a landscape type, not the city. And what we saw was this real kind of complex of ethical, ecological, and aesthetic objections to the city. The city was an ugly place. It was a polluting place. It was a place of social corruption, an undesirable place in the history of American environmentalism. Many environmentalists and many environmental ethicists have talked about there being, therefore, an urban blind spot in environmental ethics and ecology. And you have a paper about that subject, and we're going to talk more about that. And the blind spot idea suggests that maybe the city has been ignored in environmental ethics, but not just environmental ethics. In fact, many have argued that an equally troubling blind spot exists in the science of ecology. So my colleague at Arizona State, Nancy Grimm, an urban ecologist, has argued that ecologists also ignored the urban environment for most of the 20th century, and that this was a problem. Because this, of course, is where most people live, increasingly going to be in the 21st century, perhaps up to 70% or more living in cities and urban areas by mid-century. So this is a very important landscape to understand ecologically, and certainly that recognition has led more and more ecologists in recent years to turn to the city as a potential laboratory for urban experimentation. And we see this kind of joint scientific and policy goal motivating a lot of this attention. That the goal is to learn about cities as coupled natural and social systems to increase their resilience and their sustainability over the long run. There are a number of attempts to green the city historically, and so these can kind of be seen as a counterpoint to that anti-urbanism. And one certainly was the work of Frederick Law Olmsted and his colleagues in the urban parks movement in the U.S. In the mid and late 19th century. And Olmsted and his allies had these views that cities needed to be green because they were not sufficiently supportive of a healthy and aesthetically pleasing lifestyle. And so the introduction of parks, the introduction of parkways in the urban form would have a therapeutic benefit, an aesthetic and psychological, spiritual, and perhaps even political benefit, allowing people to mix and to mingle and the classes to reduce tension among them in public places. And of course, Central Park is Olmsted's greatest legacy perhaps on the American landscape, and one that is quite magnificent in terms of scale, size, scope, and just the sheer ability to bring green nature into one of the densest parts of the United States. Olmsted's ideas were developed in a number of ways, and that we can trace a number of different lineages in the effort to green the city, both here in the United States and also in Europe. The Garden City idea is a good example in the late 19th century of some of these attempts to naturalize the city and to bring the city in balance with the countryside. Ebenezer Howard was the great author of the Garden City idea. And the notion here was simply to create a human-scaled city of about 30,000 people that would be surrounded by a green belt. Growth would be limited. Heavy industry would be separated from residences. And this would be very much a kind of pedestrian-oriented, human-scaled approach to urban life. There were some experiments performed on this urban form. One is Letchworth in England. And the Garden City idea was, in many respects, a kind of utopian experiment in cooperative living in a human-scaled environment. But it also informed subsequent attempts in the United States and elsewhere, including the New Towns movement, New Urbanism, and Green Urbanism that we see developing around the end of the 20th century. So cities in the U.S. like Reston, Virginia, or Columbia, Maryland, were inspired by this Garden City model to some degree. These were post-war communities that were planned to get people out of the dense cities, out of the congested cities. These were meant to be smaller, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use communities, integrated with nature. And we really see these as developmental stops on the larger evolution of a kind of green urbanist movement in the United States. An interesting development in this shift toward greening the city or toward greening urbanism is the rise of what some have called biophilic cities. And biophilia is an interesting and somewhat controversial idea proposed by the biologist E.O. Wilson and others. And the idea is that we have an innate, perhaps genetic, predisposition to affiliate with nature, with biodiversity. We are attracted to other organisms and to nature more generally. And that there are reasons why we would be so attracted, that in fact we receive social, psychological, spiritual, and aesthetic, other kinds of benefits from this human contact with nature. Regardless of whether you think this is genetic or merely learned, cultural in other words, it's very clear that the idea of being attracted to nature and receiving benefit, individual, personal, or social benefit from incorporating cities into urban areas, that this is increasingly attracting the interests of planners and architects and designers. And so the movement of biophilic cities, or creating indicators for what a biophilic city is, the number of parks, tree cover, miles of walking trails, and local knowledge and so forth, is really starting to gain some traction in urban sustainability circles. It's quite interesting. One of the readings you have for today is by David Owen, who wrote this book called Green Metropolis. And he's one of the authors of this shift in conceptualizing green landscapes that I introduced in the beginning. And what Owen argues is that our traditional understanding of what a green lifestyle is often conjures up ideas of the pastoral landscape, let's say Vermont in New England in the United States. Owen actually argues that the greener landscape of today and the future will be the dense city. It'll be the dense city where we live in smaller environments in terms of apartments and smaller dwellings. We live closer, so there are shared efficiencies there, and we are less dependent on the automobile. All of those conditions, Owen says, are not met in the countryside. They are met in the city. And so he's really trying to subvert the idea of what a green landscape is, away from the traditional bucolic pastoral view toward a dense urban form. And in many respects, in books like Green Metropolis and the reading you have for today, you see some earlier linkages to earlier thinking in urban planning. I think Owen is indebted to Jane Jacobs, whose book, The Death and Life of the Great American Cities, developed this idea of celebrating the dense urban neighborhood and the civic qualities of cities, and that this form reinforced community and also had within it environmental efficiencies that were quite important. And finally, what I want to talk about is the urbanization of environmentalism. You have a reading on the rise of the environmental justice movement and its relationship to ecosystem ecology. Environmental justice is focused on the distribution of environmental goods and bads in, let's say, an urban environment, also could be a rural environment. The environmental justice movement has really refocused what it means to talk about the environment as a place, not the great outside or the wild, but where we work, where we live, and where we play. And I introduced some terms earlier, civic ecology being one of them, but we could also say civic environmentalism, that suggests this kind of local, community, place-based orientation to a lot of environmentalism today in the United States and Europe and around the world. An interesting quote that I think encapsulates a lot of this discussion around naturalizing the city is from the book Breakthrough by Nordhaus and Schellenberger, and they take a strong line on this question. They say that cities really are as organic and natural as forests. And to embrace this idea, they say, is not to say that all development is necessarily good, but it's to reject the idea that there's a single pure or essential character to place any more than there's a single pure or essential nature. So this is a very interesting idea, and it marks this shift, I think, toward a more natural understanding of what the city could be. There are some trade-offs, however, and I'll leave you with these, and I think this is something to think about as we're celebrating the city perhaps as an urban landscape and greening the city. And one of those trade-offs is certainly to say that cities also continue to have environmental impact. And so recent studies, a very recent one in fact, just published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, suggested that present and future urbanization were actually threatening to biodiversity hotspots around the world, areas of incredible conservation concern. And so we have to remember that the celebration of the city is often the celebration from an environmental standpoint of the compact and dense city, not the sprawling city that would gobble up the countryside and put increasing pressure on biodiversity. So some final questions that I want to leave you with for the readings are, well, to start, do you think there is this anti-urban bias in environmentalism? And if so, is this necessarily a bad thing? Are attempts to green the city really vital to our well-being, let's say as the proponents of the biophilic city might have it? Do we need to encounter nature in our daily lives in order to develop a meaningful connection to the natural world and also to be sustainable? Can you identify an example of an environmental injustice in your own city? And finally, are there any risks in advocating an urban environmental ethic? Could this actually undermine the protection of wild species and landscapes?